I have been seeing this, and I think Paul might have written it here and left it on the podium for everyone to remember. Is the world better off because you're in it? It's question mark. And now with that, I would like to welcome on stage back Paul Polman, former Chief Executive Officer of Unilever and the co-author of Net Positive, How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take, and will be hosted by Hsieh, WWF-Singapore, Chairman of the Board, also Chairman of the NUS Board of Trustees and Board Member of the Singapore Investment Corporation. Please give a big round of applause to Hsieh and Paul.
Your mic is okay?
It's cozy.
Okay, cozy. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for staying on. I hope this next half hour will be as engaging as what you've heard through the day, perhaps even more so, because we have with us Paul Polman. It's a very special treat because for me, it was a special treat for sure for the last day and a half that I was with him. I met him 10 years ago, or a little more, and this was at Temasek, and we were then having a discussion on corporate stewardship. How do you actually treat a company and run it for the long term? And he was clearly a fine example already then. 10 years later, here we are, we meet again, and I think what might be worth, bearing in mind is that what we shared today about nature diminishing and all that. I don't know how many of you in the room were there in the seas in 1965. If you were there snorkeling, as I did, in the waters of Singapore, and certainly in the waters of Malaysia. And then, of course, to do this again 50 years later, 60 years later, which I've done, and then you see there's without doubt that the number 70% drop in species, certainly there's a 70% drop in the fishes in the sea in terms of the richness, the number, the variety. And this goes on, I think, even as you travel up and down Malaysia. I was traveling up and down Malaysia in 1965 too. And then again, as you travel up and down Malaysia, the whole landscape has changed. The jungles are no longer by the side of the road. They were there actually on the side of the road at the edge. So actually for Paul, if I think about it, in 2009, when he took on as CEO, he was a revolutionary. I went through this whole change, and I was then Stock Exchange CEO in 2009. I certainly didn't have one bit of courage as much as Paul has to actually take on this journey and to see the light, actually, someone like him. So I'm actually curious, in fact, Paul, if I may sort of go into your psyche a little and ask you about your religious conversion in this regard. How did you get into this, fervor, this passion? And by the way, I also found out, as I was just trying to understand a bit of his background, he nearly became a priest. So there's something about Paul, something about him deeper, and how this actually fired him up on this journey. Could you tell us about your firing up for this journey?
No, thanks for, and it's, ending on the priest thing, I think we're beyond the time of preaching. And as we've heard many times this morning, we need action. So we'll focus on that. But this is not new. It's always a little bit déjà vu. When we grew up in the 60s and 70s, we had Rachel Carlson with Silent Spring. We had in the 90s, we had Earth Day in the 70s. We had the first Rio in 92. You had Hansen warning about the effects of climate change. I mean, this is not new what we're talking about here. And when I grew up in the Netherlands, it was about a little bit more than 10 years after World War II. And my parents, who had 6 children, they didn't worry about how much money I was going to make. They were more concerned by the impact we were going to have in this world. They wanted better communities, they wanted peace, they wanted their children to have education, what they were deprived of. So all of this to say they wanted a better world for all, based on some sound values of dignity and respect for everybody, inclusion, equity, compassion. These are universal values. So that's how I grew up. Accidentally, I ended up in business. It wasn't my plan. Actually, I wanted to be a priest and I wanted to be a doctor. Then my father made it clear that I had to make my own living one day. So in the Netherlands, when you can't get into these other studies, you end up doing law, you do economics. I ended up doing economics and got hired by a company. And in those days, you did your career path and you kept your head down and started working. But I've always felt that the role of business was to do the right thing. If you can't make a living by being honest, you should find another profession, And, we're discovering increasingly that the world is on fire, as we've seen literally on the films here. But it's also clear to me that business is holding the hose. You cannot solve these things without the active involvement of business. So then people say, oh, it's courageous you did those things. I actually don't think so. I think it's very courageous to know what's going on and to deliberately do the wrong thing. Because that takes courage to live with that for the rest of your lives, or when you ever have to be held accountable at one point in time, which we all have to. So courage doesn't come from doing the right thing, I think. But so anyway, when I got into business, then it became clear to me the enormous force that the private sector has to change these things, but also the enormous opportunity that is there. I was very fortunate to be asked by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon at that time to be part of the task force to help develop the Sustainable Development Goals. And we spent about 2.5 years talking to all different groups of society, women, people with disabilities, youth, farmers, and the list goes on. And it was like drinking from a fire hose. Not only did we see the shortcomings, because it's sort of a scorecard of where we fall short still, but I also saw this being translated into enormous opportunity. So I thought, why don't we put it at the heart of our business and seize these opportunities to grow our business? And to do that, you have to get a license to operate, so to speak. So you have to get permission from society, who gives you your reason for being in the first place. And no better way than doing that by gaining trust and make positive contributions instead of making things worse. So that's how we started with something called the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, and it served us well. That's how we also ensured that in the Sustainable Development Goals are many things that were directly related to our business. Sanitation, hand washing is a good example. Food security is a good example. When you have 1 billion people going to bed hungry, you also have the potential to develop a market for 1 billion people. When you have 5 million children dying every year below the age of 5, you have a huge market to provide products that give the right sanitation to avoid these issues. So turn these challenges around and make them opportunities. And I think business would be well served not only for their own benefit and ultimately their shareholders, but also for guaranteeing their long-term existence in this world. And it's actually sad to see that when I was born, the average lifetime of a business was 67 years. And now it's about 12 years. The average tenure of a CEO was normal to be more than 10 years. Now it's less than 4.5 years. So we ought to read the lessons in that we have the wrong leaders and we're running these businesses the wrong way for today's world. So it's time that, in that sense, that we wake up and start to do things differently. And that's what I was trying to do in my own modest way. But the bigger impact was to show that business can be done successfully differently. We ended up outperforming our industry, the market, every year growing top and bottom line, giving a 300% shareholder return. So I don't think there's any trade-off in what we do. It's actually the opposite. So often you get the question, what do you give up? Can purpose and profit live together? Does sustainability not put you at a competitive disadvantage? And I can only say that in general, there are always exceptions, but in general, it couldn't be farther from the truth. One reinforces the other. And I think we made that abundantly clear.
Well, Paul, I mean, let me repeat, what he did was revolutionary. And I tell you, this statement, which I found in his personal summary, and he said, business in service of humanity. Okay, most of us will say, I would say the mantra for business is always, the customer is God. The customer is king. So they only think of customers, but you thought beyond customers. You thought of humanity. And I would say this is really quite a different lens. Now, I wish, like you, I wanted to be a doctor too. I didn't become one. The difference is I never thought of becoming a priest. So maybe if I had thought of becoming a priest, I would have found the same mantra of business in service of humanity. But I think that's quite a different lens to put on when you think about business that way. Actually, in the last day or so, he had quite a few quotable quotes. I like to just quote one. He said, "Fear is reactive. Courage is active." Our dear CEO, Vivek, said, "Anxiety," what was your words? As opposed to agency, right? Don't just be paralyzed by anxiety, take agency. Same sides, same point, but if you think about it, it's absolutely correct. You react to fear, but if you have courage, you actually take action, you lead, you will. So it's easier said than done, really. And I want to pose this question to Paul because when I was CEO of the Singapore Exchange, no doubt in the 2000s and even certainly in the 90s, in the 80s, the primacy was profit is your goal in business. And I am ashamed to say I did what I call CSR and not what Paul would now call net positive. CSR was just a token act of giving a more human face to business, which I did. I tried. But I didn't think further than he did, far further. So I want to ask you that, many of us may not be CEOs. Many of us are CEOs, but of much smaller enterprises. In other words, we are all dealing with much smaller companies, smaller situations. Perhaps give us a guide. How do you find courage to act when you're down the totem pole? Because when you are CEO of Unilever, global CEO with millions of customers, billions of dollars, you could argue that he therefore could make bigger, bolder moves. But I can tell you this, if I'm holding the same leash as he had, it wouldn't be so easy because that weight of legacy of a very old established business, the huge amounts of money, the huge amounts of customers, sometimes actually make you do the tried and tested rather than you break free and do something dramatically different. So, but I want to pose to you, how do you find courage for any one of us who have only done token steps? Perhaps we try and mitigate the worst of what we do, but how do we actually take that bigger and bolder step?
Yeah, so thanks. There's a lot in there. So I think at the end of the day, we looked at, especially during COVID, we could see two bifurcations happening that were clearer to me than perhaps at any time. The first one was in companies that were run myopically short-term by the quarters for the shareholders were not doing so well as companies that had sustainability at the core of their strategies, had a longer-term vision, embraced partnerships, had a stronger sense of purpose. So we clearly saw a bifurcation in business models. But for the first time, we also saw a bifurcation in leadership. We saw that leaders with a high sense of empathy, compassion, purpose, thinking multi-generational, that these leaders instilled a certain sense of tranquility in a very uncertain world. And so what makes these leaders special? Well, so I think the key ingredients to get to your level of courage, and that's also why we called the book How Courageous Companies Thrive by Giving More Than They Take. And courageous companies are made up of courageous people. We found two characteristics that kept coming up all the time. And that was, the first one was a strong sense of purpose. Mark Twain said there are two moments of life that are important: the moment you're born and the moment you found out why you were born. So a stronger sense of purpose, but that alone is not enough. You also need to have a high level of empathy, because empathy really puts yourself in someone else's shoes and translates that into action. And if you have these two together, you probably have the ingredients of courage. At Unilever, when I started, in fact, the first year, I spent an entire year correcting some of the left brain business things that needed to be corrected. And I gave us some breathing room. But I actually spent the whole year on working on our personal development. I asked Bill George, who has written a wonderful book called True North. Bill teaches at Harvard now. He used to be the CEO and chair of a company called Medtronic. I said, Bill, I've never been a CEO. I'm a little worried that I'm not qualified for the job. Can you help me? And if you don't, I might not take the job. But I said the first thing we need to do is to ensure that all of our people have a sense of purpose, that all of our people have their own sustainability, because you cannot be a sustainable company if you're not sustainable yourself. You cannot be a purpose-driven company if you don't have a purpose yourself. So we spent a year on that, and as we spent that year on that, on our own purpose, on how to influence others with that, how to get results, still the most popular training course in Unilever, if I may say, we also saw that collectively the organization came up with bigger challenges. It takes courage to take responsibility of your total impact in the world. Many companies take responsibility of scope 1 or scope 2, but too many still think they can outsource your value chain and also outsource your responsibility. That just doesn't work anymore. It takes courage to set targets in line with science, which is what we did. Too many set targets that they can get away with. I call them targets not to lose versus targets to win. It takes courage to work with others in these transformative partnerships that we now need, because you might sometimes hear a little bit the uncomfortable truths. It takes courage to work with governments, which are in a very difficult position right now, to work on positive advocacy and not just advocate for your own self-interest, but what is best for society. So all these things require that courage, and it comes from that stronger sense of purpose. It comes from that higher level of empathy. What keeps me going in all of this, because you get good and bad news, and not every day is the same. And frankly, these are tests. I always look at them as tests of resilience. If things would be so easy, someone would have done it before us. But I just keep reminding myself with practicing my mental or moral muscle, which I think is more important even than our physical muscles, is to remind myself how lucky I was to be born in the Netherlands. We had a piece of bar soap at home, so I didn't have a problem of sanitation. We had food at home, so I didn't have a problem of stunting. We had free education from the Dutch government. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been sitting here. My father, who had no education because of the war, worked in a factory. So I had basically won the lottery ticket of life without doing anything for it. But that's only 5% of the world's population, unfortunately. So if we don't put ourselves to the service of the other 95%, it's never going to work. And I have days that I feel sorry for myself, or why you do all this stuff. Isn't it better to do like all these other CEOs and hang around the golf course or go sailing in the Bahamas? But then I always get reminded, one of our foundations works in Africa. We have about 25,000 children in schools that are blind or deaf-blind. And it's called Unlocking Literacy for Life. And I go there a few times a year. The head office is in Kenya, in Nairobi. We're in 8 countries around there. But, and I hear these young kids, 12, 13, 14 years old. I want to be a doctor so that others don't get blind. I want to be a teacher so that the education is integrated also with people with disabilities. So then I just wake up again and say, am I not fortunate? You know, every day being able to count your blessings gives you that energy to not complain or feel victimized, but to put yourself to the service of truly the people that need that help. And if you can do that, life is very good. Someone said, you know, greed is good, but generosity always wins over time. And so I'd like to live my life with that. And the more you give, actually, it's very selfish, but the more you give, the better you feel. That's the interesting part of it.
Well, in Jim. Well, I think I hope, we found in that the nugget for courage, which is to begin by finding yourself. And I would like to encourage all of you, actually, where possible, come along with WWF on this journey, where you go right into the heart of nature. And then I think when you're exposed to nature, when you're immersed in it, I believe that will open up a different you, and you might find at least the opening of yourself. And that's what nature is. And what Paul has just shared is this, this flow of humanity that comes from being connected to human beings.
Yeah,
and the flow of nature that comes from being connected with nature.
Yeah, 100%. So I would even go one step further, because it's not only being connected with nature, it's ultimately understanding that we are integral part of nature. They did some studies that companies that were located outside of cities were actually better in integrating nature-based solutions in their businesses or having a more holistic business plan than people that are in cities. I think one of the problems that we have is we have encircled ourselves with concrete, 70% of the world population basically. An average kid in school doesn't know the difference anymore between a cucumber and an aubergine, or where tomatoes come from. If you ask a kid in school, where does water come from? He says, out of the tap. So we've lost this connection with nature. And the other thing is we've lost the connection with each other. We think we have more contacts and little love marks by being on all these social media. But the average American has just one real friend they can talk to. The biggest disease in the world right now is loneliness. So separating ourselves from nature, separating ourselves from each other is a recipe for disaster. Hubert Reeves, who was a philosopher in Canada, said it very well when he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that a visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. So unless we realize that we're an integral part of nature, will we not solve this problem? I've often said, as long as we value a dead tree more than a tree alive, we are in trouble, and we still haven't fully realized that yet.
Well, when you go into the world of nature, you will encounter people who live amidst it, and they truly understand that that's where God is, right in the heart of where they live, and they treat nature with reverence.
Absolutely. And that's in the biodiversity. I was in Cali the other day in Colombia, obviously, with the COP. But now having official recognition that indigenous peoples need to be part of that is incredibly important, because they're actually the best stewards of nature. We're doing the same in the COP30 now, as Manuel was saying, being sure that they not only have a seat at the table, but I'd advocate giving them the table we've created a group now globally, which is Planetary Guardians, we call it, with some of, Sylvia Earles or Mary Robinsons and many other great people, where the center of our activity is not only to make clear the integral part of all these planetary boundaries, but also to put humanity in the center. Coming back to your first point, we've just forgotten that this is about humanity. We, with Milton Friedman's and others, we got down to spreadsheets, to data, to raw numbers. We've forgotten that it is about humans. The beauty of the Sustainable Development Goals is, at the heart of the goal is the most overriding goal to not leave anybody behind. The reason we are so slow on climate change, not to get sidetracked, but we were missing the boat of speed on climate change, is because we talked science, we talked particles per million in the atmosphere, we talked fear. We did all the wrong things to get into the hearts and minds of people. So if we put people central in all we do, I think we would be more successful in solving the issues of humanity.
You mentioned about your time at Unilever, and yesterday you mentioned how you partnered with WWF.
Yeah, my whole life actually. I've been
Tell
a
us
member
about
as well.
your journey and why did you do that, for the company?
Well, I didn't
Why was
only
it,
do it for the company. I always felt that we didn't have all the knowledge, and we didn't. Sometimes the best things, if you want to embed them, is to work with others. If you want to drive systems change, too many companies are focused on some projects that need to be handled here and now, but they miss the bigger and bolder transformations that are needed. I've always felt that if Unilever would be sustainably sourcing its materials, and we tended to be well ahead of our competitors, it didn't interest me. I got recognized for that. We got all the prizes, but the world still is in trouble. So I've always felt we need to drive these systems changes. And if you want systems change, you need to be at the intersection of civil society, policy, and private sector. And people like WWF have an incredibly crucial role to play, not only with the passion they bring to it, the deep knowledge, but what you see over and over in all the panels, this connectivity to real human beings. And if you make these alliances around many of the things we were doing, then you embed it into an organization. Ultimately, you embed it into a culture. And frankly, many of the things that you set as objectives, you could not achieve alone. When we said we want to reach 1 billion people with hand washing and go around the world and all the schools and got all the first ladies in the countries to be our ambassadors and all that, it would be impossible for a company to be economically viable and do that. So we had to work with USAID, with the Gates Foundation, with DFID in the UK, with UNICEF, that were helping us put these programs in place. But by doing so, we normalized it, we embedded it. To create 100 million jobs with tea plantations or livelihoods, which we did, it is impossible for a company alone to pay for the training of all the smallholder farmers or to enforce the implementation of, let's say, human rights standards in terms of putting these things in place. So you have to work with these broader partnerships to drive these deeper system changes and embed them, not only in the company, which was important to me for some extent, but it was far more important to embed those things into society. And anybody who runs a long-term business model that goes beyond your nose of the quarters, by definition, has to think about multi-stakeholders. And by definition, if you don't think of multi-stakeholders, you think of partnerships. So WWF has always played a key role in many of the things. In fact, Jason Clay, who runs market transformations in the US, I read his weekly newsletter when it comes out. One of the first things I will read in my mail, even now. But he had this brilliant idea at that time that nobody actually, it sounds so simple, but nobody actually thought about it. He looked at all the commodity streams of anything, from palm oil to sugar, but to fruits and vegetables, whatever. And what you see is that there is a concentration in any of these commodity chains of industries. So he simply said, let's focus on those industries and drive them to get to these tipping points. And these were market transformations that really happened. For us, that was, for example, palm oil. Not an easy challenge, as we heard on the panel this morning, but it would not have been possible to start that without WWF. We would not have had the credibility to start the round table of sustainable palm oil without WWF. In fact, now I have a farm, as I was telling you yesterday, in the UK, and we were working on the UK food policy and land use policy. And again, the first ones I would invite are WWFs. I'd invite also Greenpeace and others, obviously the business community, governments, the farmers' unions, but to have these civil society organizations there is actually what gives you the legitimacy to work these things, and frankly also creates the trust that we need to succeed. So absolutely crucial.
Well, there's only 1 minute on the screen left for us, but I'll indulge as chairman to extend it by a couple more minutes, if I may. But Paul, I'd like you to leave some last words with our colleagues and friends and supporters here in the audience. Actually, there's one question raised, but I would wrap that question around this earlier point I made. And the point, the question was really, how can the non-CEOs or those, further down the totem pole, do something for humanity which is meaningful in their respective roles and express themselves? I think you've explained it, but maybe you want to leave a last thought or two. And if I can also just put into it as well, there's an overriding question I have, which I had wanted to ask, which was really, we live in a world where palm oil surrounds us all along, and if you were leading government, how would you deal with the palm oil issue? So, two different questions. Perhaps you can wrap it all up in one, with one.
And very closely related. The palm oil issue is an hour's discussion in itself. But as I said before, a lot of progress has been made, and we should be pleased about that. But at the same time, even where we are today, only about 20% is sustainably sourced. It's not a very well monitored market. There are now issues, you have a lot of waste around palm oil. As you go for the palm kernel, you have a lot of the other stuff that is being used as biofuel now. And now we find out that there is more biofuel coming from palm oil than palm oil that we're producing. So it doesn't make any sense. So it's a market that still isn't transparent. The issues with the smallholder farmers, we still are not able in many places to give them a livelihood. With President Jacobi, especially with President Yudhoyono, we made a lot of progress on restoring peatlands, on protecting forests, partly driven by technology. We can now monitor, and we mapped with satellites and then concessions, we can see where the fires are. So the bigger companies now, the Wilmars of this world, the Aprils, they're probably doing what they can to be more responsible, but the issue is still in the smallholder farmers. And now the challenge again is, although we've seen great progress in Indonesia, it's actually going in the wrong direction again now. Indonesia has made a good decision, which I certainly fully support, to be food independent. No country of that size should be forced to import good food. But we shouldn't produce the food by cutting down more forests. Right now, as we talk, 1.2 million acres is cut down in Papua to again have someone become another billionaire by putting a palm oil plantation there. It just doesn't make sense. And this in a country that has 12 million acres of degraded land that we could actually regenerate, that is better located closer to the people, Sumatra or Java or whatever, where more of the population lives. So we have to work together with other countries to be sure that we put systems in place that benefit us all, and more importantly, benefit Indonesia as well. The standards are coming in. The European carbon border adjustments, the anti-deforestation legislation. But more importantly, a country like Indonesia to grow and to prosper, which is in all of our benefit, needs foreign direct investment. If it slips to the wrong direction, it will severely affect the image of the country, and it will severely affect the investments that will flow into the country. So you're talking about something that is quite fundamental, and I certainly want to be part of that solution. I'm not here to criticize, because I told President Prabowo that there are quite a lot of options where it can be done better, where the country actually benefits, just as we have shown in Unilever how we produce palm oil there and create livelihoods. So coming to your last question, and you alluded that before already, you know, the worst thing that you now encounter is fear or is helplessness, that people feel they cannot make a difference, and that is nothing could be further from the truth. Anything that has happened in the world of magnitude has been started by individuals. You know, it was Rosa Parks who refused to stand up in the bus and change the face of racial segregation in the US. It was Nelson Mandela who rose to a higher moral ground than we've ever seen. It was Gandhi who chased the Brits out of India at the end of the day. So, and I could go on and on and on. It's individuals that make the difference. And any idea that we have is always born somewhere between these 10 centimeters in someone's mind, who then has he or she, the moral courage to make that come alive. So don't feel you don't have agency. And in an attack that we now see, an attack on sustainability, an attack on morals, an attack on global cooperation, the whole idea that is happening here, and you can read it every day in the newspapers or on social media, is to instill fear that paralyzes us, that disempowers us, so that the other side has the advantage, if you want to. So the most important thing is that we see ourselves as crucial. Every one of us, every individual one of us, is born with a little diamond inside of us that we have to make shine. The key characteristic of a good leader is to unlock that energy in others. And if you can do that, it's this incredible what happens. I have 7 grandchildren. I don't see them as much as I want to. I feel bad about that, but that's part of the compromise that I have to make in doing other things. But when I'm there, I read stories with them, and bedtime stories, so they like that. And I like it because that's sort of the books I understand. And but I've never read a book to them about these heroes, because every book has a hero. I've never read a book to them that ends with, and then the hero gave up. It just doesn't exist. So the worst thing we can do is to give up. The most important thing we need to do is get courage ourselves, work on ourselves, but then more importantly, work together to unlock that collective courage. More important now than ever. What is frightening to me to see, and why we have a lack of leadership, is how you see how quickly the CEOs, especially in the US, literally flipped 180 degrees. How there is an eerie silence when you know that norms are being moved, who then become normalized if you don't say anything. So anybody who is silent de facto becomes complicit to the crime that is being committed. So I've written enough about it. You can go to my LinkedIn account or other things. But this is a moment of collective leadership before it slips away from us. And I was very pleased to see Lawrence Wong, your Prime Minister, who had a wonderful 10 minutes, and I recommend anybody, if you haven't seen it yet, to look at what he said in Parliament about the tariffs and what it means for the world. But he took the high ground and the high moral ground in what we all should be doing. And frankly, we need more leaders to stand up now. This is a moment where courage counts double. This is a moment where humanity can show, that we are worth being proud of. And frankly, this is a moment that we all say, we won the lottery ticket of life. So it is our duty, it is our obligation now to collectively solve these issues for the rest of the world. So there you have it.
Thank you so much. I mean, I was just standing there. I was almost getting on my toes. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Fuwa, for those inspiring remarks. I think that's what keeps us going on and on and on, no matter how difficult things get and no matter how many CEOs flip because of a change in a certain government. We must keep going on, and I hope that gave you the energy as much as it gave to some of us who are listening to that amazing conversation, and I hope we can have more of that in the future.